This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and much more dangerous, because somewhere along the way, a basic assumption stopped being safe. The idea that public power is neutral, that federal money follows rules, that services are delivered because you qualify, not because you comply. What's happening now doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't even argue. It simply asks a new question behind closed doors. Not what does the law require, but who deserves it? And once that question is asked, everything changes. Energy, health, childcare, elections, even expertise itself. If you've ever assumed the system can't be turned against whole regions at once, hold on to that thought. Just hold it. Don't let go yet. If this matters to you, stay with me, because the next step isn't louder. It's more methodical, and once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. For a long time, we told ourselves a story about control. That laws controlled outcomes. That budgets controlled priorities. That institutions controlled behavior. But that's no longer what's actually in charge. What controls the system now is discretion without consequence. The quiet belief that once money is approved, it can still be steered, delayed, frozen, redirected, not by rule, by preference. This is where the problem gets misread. People look for villains, personalities, temper tantrums. But this isn't impulsive. It's procedural. Because when power realizes it can decide how a law is carried out, it starts testing something more dangerous than authority. It tests obedience, not openly, never openly. It tests whether regions can be pressured, whether silence can be purchased, whether compliance can be rewarded without saying the word. And the system doesn't break all at once when this happens. It bends quietly, unevenly. The real question isn't who's in charge. It's what happens when neutrality is no longer the default. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly enough that most people missed it. And that's where this gets harder to stop. The most dangerous changes are the ones that feel administrative. They arrive without speeches, without votes, without alarms. There was a time when federal support followed formulas, eligibility, need, statute. Before, the question was simple, does this qualify? Now the question is different, does this align? And that difference matters more than it sounds. Because alignment doesn't have to be announced. It can be implied. In pose, in delays, in what gets processed first. And what doesn't, nothing is formally rewritten. No rule is officially erased. On paper, everything still looks intact. But in practice, something subtle changes. Outcomes start clustering. Benefits stop being evenly distributed. Certain places wait longer. Others don't wait at all. This is how normalization works. Not through shock, through repetition. Each decision alone looks defensible. Together, they form a pattern. And once a system accepts that pattern, it doesn't feel radical anymore. It feels routine, which is exactly when it becomes hardest to reverse. Because the moment you notice it, the shift is already underway. Here's where the shift stopped being theoretical. At one point, enormous sums of federal money were suddenly placed in jeopardy. Not millions, billions, funds already approved, already allocated, already promised for long-term projects, and then quietly, they were marked for removal, not because the projects failed, not because the math changed, but because of where they were located. Entire regions were singled out, not for what they built, but for how they voted. That distinction mattered. Because it crossed a line, the system depends on pretending doesn't exist. When this reached the courts, the response was blunt, not cautious, not deferential, illegal. That word lands hard in a system built on discretion, because it means the line wasn't blurry after all. It was crossed. The funding didn't just represent money. It represented a test. Could federal investment be turned into a loyalty filter? The answer, at least that time, was no. But notice what didn't happen. The attempt didn't stop future attempts. It simply showed where resistance lived. And that's where the pressure shifted next. If this feels distant, don't relax yet. The next move didn't target infrastructure. It targeted people. This is how it actually works. Not through one sweeping order, not through a single dramatic cut, but through leverage layered on top of dependency, because federal funding isn't just money. It's timing, it's permission, it's survival margins. When funds are frozen, even temporarily, the damage doesn't land evenly. Large institutions absorb the delay. Smaller systems don't. Childcare centers close first. Local agencies stall. Families feel it before anyone issues a press release. And here's the quiet asymmetry. The people who decide don't absorb the cost. They don't lose care. They don't lose work hours. They don't miss rent. The cost travels downward, always downward. That's why this mechanism is so effective. It doesn't need to announce punishment. It just withholds relief. And once that becomes normal, something else happens. Criticism becomes risky. Dissent becomes expensive, because when survival is conditional, silence starts to look rational. This is where a system stops asking whether something is legal and starts asking whether anyone can afford to object. That's not an accident. It's the point. And once that logic exists, it doesn't stay contained. It looks for the next pressure point. Then it's spread faster. Shorter freezes, sharper threats, less pretense. Money paused, grants pulled, approvals stalled. Not everywhere, selectively. Criticism was followed by consequences. Not debates, consequences. Professional groups spoke, funding vanished. States resisted. Funds were threatened. Rules weren't changed. Pressure was, and each move sent a signal. Quiet, clear. You don't have to be told, you just have to notice. Because once retaliation works once, it doesn't need to be repeated loudly. It only needs to be remembered. This is how systems discipline behavior without issuing commands. They let fear do the work. The pushback came quickly. Judges intervened, orders issued, funding restored. But pay attention to the rhythm, action, block, repeat. Each cycle tighter than the last. Because this wasn't about winning any single fight. It was about learning where resistance lived and how fast it moved. And the moment that map was drawn, the strategy adjusted again. The next arena wasn't money for projects. It was control over the rules themselves. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because when funding becomes conditional, you don't experience it as a headline. You experience it as friction. You wait longer. Your costs go up. Your options narrow. Childcare gets harder to find. Health coverage gets more expensive. Programs you didn't even know were federally supported suddenly feel unstable. And no one sends you a notice explaining why. From your position, it just looks like the system failing. Again, quietly. But failure implies accident. This isn't that. This is pressure moving through ordinary life, through schedules, through bills, through decisions you didn't expect to have to make. And here's the part that's hardest to see from the inside. None of this requires you to do anything wrong. It only requires you to be in the wrong place, or to rely on the wrong service, or to speak at the wrong moment. If this feels familiar, stay with me, because what looks personal is actually structural. And once this logic reaches the people who write the rules, not just follow them, it doesn't stop at domestic consequences. It travels. Once this kind of pressure works at home, it doesn't stay domestic, because other systems are watching. Allies, markets, institutions that depend on predictability. When federal commitments start looking conditional, trust erodes outward, long-term projects hesitate. Partnerships slow. Investment waits for clarity that never quite arrives. And it's not announced as instability. It's framed as uncertainty. Uncertainty about funding, about rules, about whether agreements survive political shifts. That uncertainty spreads faster than any single policy because it forces everyone downstream to plan defensively. Governments hedge. Organizations diversify away. Global systems recalibrate around the idea that guarantees may not be guaranteed. This is how local discretion becomes systemic risk, not through collapse, through caution. And once caution becomes the dominant posture, momentum stalls. Innovation slows. Coordination frays, no one panics. They adapt, which is exactly why it's dangerous. Because by the time you can measure the damage, it no longer looks like sabotage. It looks like the new normal. And the question shifts again, not whether this can be stopped, but whether it's already been absorbed. From here, the system only has a few possible trajectories. One is adjustment. Institutions harden, rules tighten. Discretion shrinks back inside legal boundaries. The pressure stops working because it stops being available. Another is erosion. Nothing collapses. Nothing explodes. But each cycle leaves a residue. A delay here, a carve-out there. Enough that neutrality becomes theoretical instead of real. And then there's rupture. That's when conditional governance stops being tested and starts being expected. When funding decisions openly track alignment, when silence becomes a prerequisite, when access depends on compliance, not qualification. None of these paths announce themselves clearly. They overlap. They blur. And which one dominates depends on something fragile. Not intentions, not rhetoric, resistance, how fast it responds, how coordinated it is, how much cost it's willing to absorb. Because systems don't choose their futures. They drift into them. And drift favors whatever applies pressure consistently, not whatever argues best. The unsettling part isn't that the outcome is uncertain. It's that all three paths are already visible. At the same time, here's what makes this moment unstable. Nothing has snapped. Nothing has been resolved. And that's the problem, because systems don't fail when they're challenged. They fail when the challenge becomes familiar. When retaliation stops shocking, when conditionality stops being remarkable, when people adjust instead of object, the danger isn't that power tried to bend the rules. That happens. The danger is discovering how much bending the system will tolerate before it stiffens. Or doesn't. What you've watched isn't a scandal playing out. It's a rehearsal, a test of whether governance can be rerouted through pressure instead of law, whether equality can be replaced with alignment without saying so out loud. That question hasn't been answered yet. It's still open, and it won't be decided by one ruling or one election or one institution acting alone. It will be decided by whether this pattern is noticed, tracked, remembered. If you want to understand where this goes next, don't disengage now. The next chapter isn't louder, it's more refined. And once it's refined, it's much harder to stop.